The first cruelty of the season was delivered in a voice pitched for concern, not malice, and Eleanor Ashworth heard every syllable of it before the fan in her hand had finished its downward stroke. She did not turn. She did not set down her glass. She did not give him the satisfaction of a flinch, and it was this last refusal, small and silent as it was, that would matter most before the night was through. London in the spring of 1817 wore its glitter the way a debtor wears a fine coat, as if brilliance alone might settle what was actually owed, and the ballroom of Rothbury House that evening held itself very still, chandeliers blazing over 300 candles and considerably more vanity. The music thin and bright above the low continuous murmur of people deciding, in whispers, who among them still mattered. Eleanor stood where she always stood at such gatherings, near enough to the wall to be forgotten by it, in a narrow strip of shadow between a Corinthian pilaster and a potted orange tree that had been imported at some ruinous expense and was, in its way, granted more attention than she was. It was not an accident of geography. It was an arithmetic the family had performed on her so many times that she had long since stopped resenting the sum. A poor relation stood at the margins so that the center might shine unobstructed. That was the whole of the equation, and she had been solving it correctly for 2 years. There was a word the family used for her, quietly, when they believed her occupied with mending or out of earshot entirely, a word that traveled between Camilla's mouth and her husband Sir Gerald's ear, with the ease of a well-worn coin passed hand to hand. Unclaimed. It was, on its surface, only a description, the sort of word one might use for a trunk left too long at a coaching inn. Beneath its surface, it meant something considerably less kind, and Eleanor had learned to hear the difference the way one learns to hear a false note in a familiar hymn. A woman without a husband living, without a fortune of her own, without a house that bore her name, was not merely unmarried, she was unclaimed, the way land goes unclaimed, or a debt, or a grief nobody had thought worth the trouble of collecting. Her fingers found the small brass thimble hidden in the seam of her glove without her permission, worn thin on one side, where her mother's hand had pressed it against fabric 1,000 evenings running, the metal gone the soft color of an old coin from handling, rather than from any coin's worth. It was, but for a wedding ring sold 18 months ago to settle a debt of honor that had not even been her husband's own, the only object she possessed that had not first belonged to someone willing to remind her of the fact. Her mother used to say, in the small cold house where Eleanor Finch had learned everything that later proved useless to a lady and everything that later proved indispensable to a survivor, that a quiet stitch holds longer than a shouted seam, that anyone with a temper and a pair of shears could tear a piece of cloth, but it took a steady hand, and a stiller one, to mend it so the tear could not be found again. Eleanor had built a life on that sentence without ever once saying it aloud in this house, where sentences belonging to dead seamstresses were not considered currency anyone cared to spend. Across the ballroom, half hidden by a cluster of feathered turbans nodding together like conspiring birds, the man now saying her name aloud had been Mr. Julian Merrick before he married money. And he was Mr. Julian Merrick still, only richer, and considerably more pleased with the sound of his own voice than he had been 8 years earlier when he had asked Eleanor Finch to marry him, and then, upon discovering that her father's debts had not died with her father, had asked someone else instead. He had not troubled himself to speak quietly. That was, in its own way, the cruelest part, a cruelty disguised as carelessness, the kind that could always be waved away afterward as an innocent question asked too loudly in a crowded room. "Where's that husband of yours tonight, Mrs. Ashworth?" he said, tipping his glass toward the empty space beside her as though toasting an absence. "I confess I have never once laid eyes on the man in all these months." One begins to wonder whether he exists at all, or whether he is merely a convenient fiction invented to spare a widow the indignity of admitting she has no one to bring to a ball. The words wore the coat of idle wit. The intention underneath them wore no coat at all, and everyone near enough to hear understood exactly which garment was the disguise and which was the truth, though none of them would have said so aloud, because saying so would have required admitting that cruelty had been performed at all, and performed cruelty, so long as it is clever enough, is rarely called by its correct name in rooms like that one. Eleanor set her glass down on the tray of a passing footman with a hand that did not shake, though the small chip of ice at the base of her throat told her, in its private language, exactly what the effort was costing. "My husband is dead, Miss Merrick," she said, and her voice, when it came, was as level as a table set for guests who would never arrive. "You have known that for 18 months. I had not realized grief required a chaperone to be thought respectable, but I am glad to have the correction, since you have always been so reliable a source of instruction in what is and is not proper." It was not an apology. It was not, strictly speaking, an insult either, and that was precisely its design. The moral weight of the exchange quietly relocated from her shoulders to his while she stood there looking, to any observer who troubled to look closely. Entirely composed, somewhere behind her a fan stilled mid-motion. A conversation that had been rising toward laughter thinned instead into a listening silence. The particular hush of a room deciding, collectively and without a word passed between any two of its members, that something worth remembering was happening at its edges. It was not accusation, what moved through that crowd in the space of 4 held breaths. It was recognition, the recognition of blood in water, and Eleanor had learned long ago that a widow's dignity, however real, however earned, could not survive many evenings of being fed to that particular current before something of her finally gave. Julian smiled, because smiling cost him nothing and because an audience had gathered, and a man who has built his entire fortune on being liked does not waste an audience. "Grief becomes some women," he said, tilting his head as though considering a portrait rather than a person. "It makes them interesting in a way marriage rarely does, though I suppose it must be lonely, being interesting all by oneself, with no one to come and claim the credit for it." The word landed exactly where he intended it to land, on the bruise the family had been pressing for 2 years, and Eleanor felt the small brass thimble bite into her palm through the thin kid of her glove as her hand closed, once, and then deliberately did not close again. It was not the crowd's laughter that told her the wound had struck true. There was none, not really, only a ripple of the same uneasy stillness, because even a room fond of cruelty prefers it delivered with better manners than that. It was the silence itself, thickening, that told her, and it was in that silence, with no thunder overhead and no curtain falling, and not so much as a dropped glass to mark the moment as anything other than an ordinary evening continuing exactly as ordinary evenings do, that something in Eleanor Ashworth turned over quietly and did not turn back. She was so tired, she thought, in the single unspoken sentence she permitted herself, of being the only one in every room required to behave as though nothing had been said. It was not despair. It had the shape of despair's exact opposite, small and cold and clear, and she filed it away the way she filed away every insult she had ever declined to answer in kind, in the same private ledger where she had long ago stopped expecting the balance to be settled. Across the ballroom, in the doorway that led toward the card room, a man who had been standing utterly motionless for the better part of a minute set down his own glass without looking at it, and the room, which had not noticed him leave his stillness, noticed at once when he began, unhurried, to cross the floor. Alistair Calder, Duke of Rothbury, was not a man given to sudden movement, and it was precisely because he was not that his movement now drew every eye that had a moment ago been fixed on Eleanor and Julian Merrick instead. He was tall in the unremarkable way that made other men in a room seem, without any particular effort on his part, slightly diminished, and he wore black, with the kind of severity that in a lesser man would have read as mourning, and in him read simply as a refusal to be decorated, a plain coat among a great deal of embroidered vanity. The single point of color at his throat a signet ring dulled by age rather than polished for show. His grandmother's ball, his grandmother's house, his own name on half the invitations sent that week, and still he had spent the better part of the evening exactly where Eleanor had noticed him twice already, without permitting herself to notice that she had noticed, near the door, watching the room the way a man watches weather he does not entirely trust. He crossed the space between them in perhaps a dozen steps, each one unhurried, each one somehow closing more distance than its length should reasonably have allowed, and the crowd that had gathered to watch Eleanor's humiliation reassembled itself instantly, silently, into a crowd gathered to watch something else entirely, the particular hunger of a room that has caught the scent of a better story than the one it came for. He did not address Julian Merrick first. He stopped beside Eleanor, near enough that she felt the warmth radiating from his sleeve, though he did not yet touch her, and when he did finally move it was to offer his arm, not with the flourish of a man performing gallantry for an audience, but with the plain, unhesitating economy of a man closing a door that has been left open too long in a draught. Eleanor's hand found the crook of his elbow before her mind had entirely agreed to the decision, and she felt, beneath the fine wool of his sleeve, the faint and involuntary tightening of muscle that no dry voice could quite disguise, there and gone in under a second, a thing she was not meant to notice, and noticed anyway. "Here," he said, and for a moment that single word was the whole of his answer, laid down like a coin on a table where an account had been left unpaid too long. Before he continued, his voice pitched no louder than conversation and carrying, in the particular silence of that room, considerably farther than a shout would have traveled. "A husband's chief duty, I am given to understand, is to appear the instant a lady is maligned. I observed no one else attempting the office this evening, Merrick, and so I have appointed myself to it, temporarily, until the rightful claimant sees fit to return and reclaim his post." It was not a declaration. It was not, on its careful surface, anything at all beyond a dry man's dry joke at another man's expense, delivered with the particular license that great rank grants to the sort of remark that would have ended a lesser man's evening in disgrace. Beneath its surface, every person in that ballroom heard exactly what it implied, and the implication moved through the crowd faster than the orchestra could recover its interrupted phrase. Because a duke does not offer his arm to a poor relation at the edge of a ballroom without meaning for the gesture to be read. And Alistair Calder was not a man who did anything, least of all in public, without meaning it read correctly. Julian Merrick's smile did not so much fall as freeze, the particular expression of a man who has told a joke to a room and discovered, a beat too late, that the room has decided to laugh at him instead. He recovered himself well enough to bow, to murmur something about not intending offense, to retreat toward the card room with the unhurried dignity of a man who has been soundly and irrecoverably beaten and is attempting, with what remains of his composure, not to run. The room did not laugh at him outright. That would have been unkind, and unkindness delivered too plainly was, in that house at least, considered worse manners than the cruelty that had prompted it. But the laughter that did not come was, in its own quiet way, a verdict, and Eleanor understood, standing there with her hand still resting on the Duke's sleeve, and her pulse behaving in a manner she intended to discuss with no one, that something had shifted beneath her feet that would not shift back. No thunder answered him, no candle guttered in a sudden draft, no gasp swept the room in the manner of a novel, nothing so theatrical as that. The musicians, who had faltered for perhaps 4 bars during the worst of it, found their place again and resumed, and within a minute the ordinary business of the evening had reassembled itself around the two of them as though nothing at all had happened. Because that, Eleanor had learned long before that night, was how the world generally behaved after wounding someone thoroughly. It simply went on, cheerful and indifferent, exactly as if cruelty had never troubled to exist in the first place. It was some time before the Duke spoke again, and when he did it was without looking at her directly, his gaze fixed instead on the middle distance of the ballroom, with the particular stillness of a man accustomed to being watched and long practiced in giving watchers nothing to read. "You did not answer him," he said. It was not quite a question. "I did answer him," Eleanor said. "I simply declined to answer him the way he wished to be answered." A very small silence followed, and into it, unexpectedly, came something that was almost a laugh, though it never fully arrived at one, no more than a single exhale through the nose, brief and dry, and entirely without malice. "That," he said, "is the only kind of answer worth giving a man like that. The satisfied ones want blood. Deny them the blood, and you have already won more than you know." She did not know, then, what to make of a duke who spoke to her as though her dignity were an achievement rather than an inconvenience to be managed, and she said nothing further, because there are moments a wise woman recognizes as too fragile to be improved by additional speech, and this, she understood without being able to say precisely how, was one of them. He returned her, a few minutes later, to the same narrow strip of shadow between the pilaster and the orange tree where he had first found her, released her hand with a small bow that acknowledged nothing beyond ordinary courtesy, and moved on to greet other guests with the same unhurried composure he had carried across the floor to rescue her, as though the entire episode had cost him no more effort than crossing a room to retrieve a dropped glove. It was only much later, when the carriage rattled her home through streets gone quiet and cold, that Eleanor allowed herself to examine what had actually occurred, turning it over the way she once turned over a difficult seam, looking for where the fabric had been cut wrong and where it might yet be salvaged. A duke had taken her arm in front of 300 witnesses. A duke had answered an insult meant to reduce her, and had done so in a manner calculated to be repeated in every drawing room in London before the week was out. That, she understood with the particular clarity of a woman who has spent 2 years learning to read a room's temperature before it changes, was not a kindness offered lightly. It was an announcement, whether he had intended it as one or not, and announcements of that kind were rarely without cost to the person least equipped to pay it. She did not sleep well that night, and if anyone had asked her why, she would have said, quite truthfully, that it was the cold and not the warmth she had felt through fine wool, nor the particular way his voice had gone quiet and almost human for the single sentence about blood and satisfaction, before rank folded itself back over him like a coat put on against weather. Rowan Hall received the news of the evening's events before Eleanor herself arrived home to deliver it, as such news generally does, carried on swifter wings than any carriage. And by the time she came down to breakfast the following morning, Camilla Ashworth was already seated at the table, with the particular brightness of a woman who has heard something delicious and cannot decide whether to savor it privately or share it at once. Camilla was Sir Gerald's wife, and had been, for the better part of 2 years, the architect of the small daily arithmetic that kept Eleanor useful and unthanked in equal measure, and she managed this with a charm so polished that guests who witnessed only the surface of it came away, convinced she was the kindest woman in London, a devoted sister keeping a grieving widow safely under her roof out of pure Christian feeling. The truth, known only to the two women themselves, was rather less generous. It was Eleanor's hand that kept the household accounts from ruin, Eleanor's careful correspondence that maintained the family's standing with creditors and connections alike, Eleanor's needle that had produced the altar cloth for the spring charity bazaar, an intricate thing of vines and doves worked in silk so fine that the Dowager Duchess of Rothbury herself had stopped before it, for the better. Part of 10 minutes, and pronounced it the loveliest piece of English embroidery she had seen in a decade, unaware that the woman standing 3 feet away, silent, accepting a cup of tea from a passing servant, had spent 4 months of candle-lit evenings bent over every inch of it, while Camilla accepted the praise as her own, with a modesty so convincing that Eleanor herself had almost admired the performance. "Well," said Camilla now, buttering a roll with the unhurried satisfaction of a woman preparing to enjoy her own sentence before she finished speaking it, "you have certainly given the Tuns something new to discuss over their chocolate this morning. The Duke of Rothbury. Eleanor. Taking your arm. In front of Lady Petham, no less, who I am told has already told 4 people, which means by luncheon it will be 40. How very useful of you to have arranged such an interesting scene." It was, on its surface, almost a compliment, delivered in the same bright, affectionate register Camilla reserved for every barb she meant to be certain could never be answered directly, and the pressure beneath it was not affection at all, but warning, the particular warning a woman gives when she senses that a piece of furniture she had long assumed permanently fixed in its corner has, without her permission, begun to move. "I arranged nothing," Eleanor said, accepting the tea and meeting Camilla's bright gaze with a mildness that cost her considerably more than it appeared to. "Mr. Merrick chose to be cruel in public, and His Grace chose to object to it. I had very little say in either decision." Camilla's smile did not waver, but something behind it recalculated, quickly, the way a merchant's face recalculates upon discovering a customer knows the true price of the goods. "Of course," she said. "Still, one does hope you will be careful, Eleanor, not to read too much into an old man's chivalry. Dukes are famously fond of causes, particularly poor, pretty, sad little causes, and famously forgetful of them again by autumn. It would be such a shame to mistake pity for something warmer and find yourself, when the season turns, exactly where you began, only with rather further to fall." The words sounded almost tender, offered as they were in the voice of a sister concerned for a sister's welfare. The pressure underneath them was not tender at all, and Eleanor heard it precisely, the way she heard every one of Camilla's kindnesses now, as a coin held up to the light to check whether it was counterfeit, and found, invariably, that it was. "He is not 40, Eleanor said mildly, setting down her cup, "and I have not mistaken anything, since he has offered me nothing to mistake beyond an arm and a sentence, both of which I am given to understand were intended for Mr. Merrick's benefit rather than my own." It was, she thought, a tidy enough deflection, agreeing with the surface of Camilla's concern, while quietly declining to accept its underlying accusation, and Camilla, recognizing that no further ground could be gained that morning, returned her attention to her role with the faint, dismissive satisfaction of a woman who believes she has planted a seed and can afford to wait for it to grow. Sir Gerald, who had said nothing throughout the exchange beyond a vague noise of assent over his newspaper, glanced up only long enough to observe that it was decent of Rothbury to have troubled himself, decent men being in short supply these days, before returning to an account of grain prices that interested him considerably more than his sister-in-law's reputation ever had. And Eleanor understood, not for the first time, that in this house her dignity was a subject of conversation, but never quite a subject of concern. She did not mention the altar cloth. She had learned, over 2 years of uncredited competence, that mentioning it changed nothing beyond her own comfort in the mentioning, and comfort, she had further learned, was a luxury poorly suited to a woman in her position. It was some days later, at a garden party held at Lady Petham's country villa on the outskirts of town, that the world delivered its second small cruelty of the season, quieter than the first, and in its quietness somehow more thorough. The morning had turned out fine, the sort of pale, clean sunlight that makes even indifferent gardens look like something out of a psalm. And the guests moved among rosebeds and clipped hedges with the particular cheerful aimlessness of people who have nowhere urgent to be, and every intention of being seen not being there. Lady Petham herself, a woman whose social authority rested less on her fortune, which was modest, than on the sheer unshakable confidence with which she delivered her opinions, had gathered a small court around a display of needlework laid out on a trestle table beneath a striped awning, work donated by various ladies of the parish for a charity raffle, and among the pieces, folded modestly at one corner, lay a small embroidered handkerchief Eleanor had finished only the week before, a border of forget-me-nots worked so finely that even Camilla, examining it that morning, had remarked with some surprise that it was really quite good. Lady Petham lifted it now between 2 fingers, turning it toward the light with the appraising air of a woman at a shop counter. "Charming," she said. "Whose work is this?" And before Eleanor could open her mouth to answer, or decide whether answering was even wise, Camilla's voice arrived first, warm and quick and entirely without hesitation. "Mine," she said, with the particular practiced modesty of a woman long accustomed to receiving praise she had not earned. "A small thing. I find needlework so soothing of an evening. It was not even a large lie, as lies went, small enough that no one troubled to question it, small enough that Eleanor herself, standing not 3 feet away with her own hands folded before her, understood at once that objecting would cost her considerably more than the theft itself had, would read, in that garden full of watching eyes, as petty jealousy from a poor relation grasping for credit that was not, strictly, hers to claim in a house where she claimed nothing else either. So, she said, nothing. She stood in the pale, clean sunlight and watched Lady Petham praise Camilla's steady hand and delicate eye, watched the small circle of ladies nod in agreement, watched the handkerchief pass from hand to hand collecting compliments the way a coin collects fingerprints, and she felt, beneath her own composed stillness, something small and important quietly die, without ceremony, without anyone in that garden aware that a death had occurred at all. There was no scene, no one gasped, no bird fell silent in the hedges to mark the moment as significant. The party continued exactly as it had begun, cheerful and bright and entirely indifferent. The raffle proceeded, the lemonade was poured, and somewhere beneath the striped awning a woman who had spent 4 evenings bent over candlelight until her eyes ached folded her own hands and said nothing at all, because saying something, she had learned, changed only her own comfort and never the arithmetic. It is a particular kind of grief, the grief of being erased in company one cannot leave, and it asks nothing so dramatic as tears. It asks only silence and patience, and the private, corrosive knowledge that the truth exists and will very likely never be spoken. Sophie Blake found her an hour later, seated alone on a stone bench at the garden's far edge where the roses gave way to a line of old yews, and settled herself down beside Eleanor without asking permission, because Sophie had never in her life waited for an invitation before offering an opinion. Sophie Blake was a widow herself, older than Eleanor by perhaps a decade, comfortably enough situated that she owed no one in that garden anything, and blessed or cursed, with a tongue that said aloud precisely what everyone else in London preferred to leave, folded away with the good linen. "I saw that," Sophie said, without preamble. "The handkerchief. I have seen you work on that pattern 3 times this month, Eleanor Ashworth, and I have never once seen Camilla thread a needle without complaining of the light. You did not correct her." "No," Eleanor said. "And why, pray, did you not?" "Because it would not have helped," Eleanor said, "and because I have found that being right in that house is rather like being warm in a house with no fire in it. Pleasant to imagine, and no use at all to anyone." Sophie studied her for a long moment, the particular searching look of a friend deciding how much honesty a person can bear on a given afternoon, and then said, more gently than her usual manner allowed, "Well, it seems someone else has noticed what she will not credit you for. The whole of London is talking of nothing else this week but a certain duke and a certain arm." Eleanor felt the heat rise in her face before she could govern it, and looked instead toward the roses, where it could not be read. "It was an act of manners," she said. "Nothing more." "Manners," Sophie repeated, with the dry amusement of a woman who has heard a great many things called by names they did not deserve. "Eleanor, I have known Alistair Calder since he was a solemn boy of 12 who would not smile even when tickled. He does not perform manners in front of 300 witnesses for a woman he has spoken to twice. Whatever that was last week, it was not manners, and I think you know it. And I think that is precisely why you have spent the last hour hiding behind a hedge instead of enjoying your lemonade like a sensible person." Eleanor did not answer that directly, because she did not yet trust herself to answer it at all, and Sophie, recognizing the particular silence of a friend not yet ready to be teased further, let the subject drop with the easy grace of a woman confident it would keep. It was not admiration Eleanor felt, turning the memory of that ballroom over again in the quiet of the garden. Not yet, not admiration exactly, but something adjacent to it, unnamed and unwelcome, and entirely inconvenient in a life that had no room left in its budget for feeling anything at all beyond careful. It was recognition, perhaps, of a kind she had not been offered by anyone in 2 years, and recognition, she had begun to suspect, might prove considerably more dangerous to her composure than cruelty ever had, because cruelty asked nothing of her but endurance, while this asked something she had not yet found the courage to name. The Duke called at Rowan Hall for the first time some 10 days later, and he did so, with characteristic economy, on a pretext so thin that even Sir Gerald, who noticed very little that did not concern grain prices, remarked afterward that it was odd for a man of Rothbury's consequence to trouble himself over the return of a borrowed book he might easily have sent by a servant. He arrived in the early afternoon, when the light in the small back parlor fell soft and gray through tall windows onto the writing desk, where Eleanor sat each day untangling the household's accounts, a task Sir Gerald handed to her, the way one hands a difficult knot to whoever's fingers happen to be free, without particular thanks and without particular thought. She heard him before she saw him, his voice low in the hall exchanging some brief courtesy with the housekeeper, and she had barely time to set down her pen before he was shown in, filling the doorway the way a ship fills a narrow harbor mouth, too large for the room's modest proportions, and somehow, in his stillness, making the room feel not crowded but center. "Mrs. Ashworth," he said, with a small bow that acknowledged the impropriety of finding her at work and elected, gracefully, not to comment on it. "I am told I left a volume of Cowper here after your sister-in-law's card party. I find I cannot do without it another week." It was, they both understood, without either saying so, a fiction elegant enough to survive scrutiny and thin enough that neither of them believed it for a moment, and Eleanor found herself, despite every instinct toward caution that 2 years of careful living had trained into her, almost smiling as she rose to fetch it. "I was not aware you read Cowper, Your Grace," she said. "I do not," he said. "I find him tedious beyond bearing, but a man requires some excuse to call upon a household twice in a fortnight, and Cowper, God rest him, has proven a very patient accomplice." It was, she understood, an admission dressed as a joke, the particular kind of honesty a proud man permits himself only when he can retreat behind humor the instant it becomes dangerous, and she chose, for reasons she did not entirely examine, to answer it in kind rather than to flee from it. "Then I hope you have brought a second excuse prepared," she said, "since I happen to know the book is in the library and not this room, and fetching it will require rather more time than a true errand ought to take." Something moved behind his eyes then, brief and unguarded, gone before she could be certain she had seen it at all, and he said, with the particular dryness that she was beginning to understand was the only warmth his rank permitted him to show in daylight, "Then it is fortunate, Mrs. Ashworth, that I am in no hurry." He did not stay long, that first visit, no longer than propriety strictly required, but he stayed long enough to notice, with the quiet attentiveness of a man who noticed everything and remarked on almost nothing. The neat columns of figures on the desk she had not managed to hide in time, the careful hand correcting an error in addition that was, she would later learn, the very error that had cost Sir Gerald a considerable sum the previous quarter when left uncorrected. He said nothing of it directly. He only glanced at the page, and then at her, and something in his expression rearranged itself, quietly, the way a man's expression rearranges when a fact he suspected is suddenly confirmed beyond argument, and he said only, as he took his leave, that he had always found competence a rarer commodity than birth, though society persisted in valuing the second considerably above the first, an observation delivered so lightly that Sir Gerald, seeing him out, laughed and agreed as though it were merely clever conversation, entirely missing, as he generally missed most things not printed in a ledger, that it had been aimed with some precision at the room's true center rather than its nominal one. No one saw the smallest part of it, the correction on the page, the flicker of recognition it prompted, and that too was familiar to Eleanor now. This business of being seen accurately by exactly one person in a room full of people who did not trouble to look at all, and she found, turning the small brass thimble over in her pocket that evening, with the particular care she reserved for objects that had outlived their owners, that she was no longer entirely certain which frightened her more, the possibility that he had noticed nothing lasting in her at all, or the possibility that he had. The Duke returned the following week without even the thin pretense of Cowper to shield him, arriving instead with a small parcel of pressed botanical prints he claimed, with a straight face that fooled no one. Sir Gerald had expressed a passing interest in, though Sir Gerald had expressed interest in nothing that did not involve the price of barley since the coronation before last. "He is a poor liar," Sophie Blake observed afterward, watching from the window as his carriage rolled away down the drive, which is remarkable in a man who has spent 30 years being lied to by everyone who wants something from him. "He has simply never had cause to practice the skill on his own account," Eleanor said. And Sophie laughed, the short, surprised laugh of a woman who has just heard something truer than she expected. It became, over the following fortnight, a pattern the household noticed and did not remark upon aloud, because remarking upon it would have required someone in that house to admit that a duke's interest in the family's poor relation was neither accidental nor temporary, and admitting that would have cost Camilla a great deal more composure than she was willing to spend, before she had decided how best to profit from it. He called on some pretext twice more, and each time the pretense grew thinner, and each time neither of them troubled to repair it, the two of them settling instead into a rhythm of dry exchanges conducted mostly in the small back parlor, where the light fell soft and gray, and no one else in the household thought it worth their while to sit. He asked her once, watching her correct a column of figures Sir Gerald had entered backward, whether she had always possessed a talent for arithmetic, or whether necessity had simply taught it to her the way necessity teaches most useful things. Both, she said. My mother used to say that hunger is the most patient tutor there is, and never once forgives a pupil for forgetting a lesson. He considered that for a moment, turning his signet ring once around his finger in the small, unconscious gesture she had begun, despite herself, to catalogue. My tutors charged a great deal of money to teach me considerably less useful lessons, he said, and I do not believe I retained half of them. Perhaps you were not sufficiently hungry, she said, and regretted the boldness of it the instant it left her mouth, though she did not look away, because looking away would have been its own kind of confession. Something crossed his face then, quick as a bird's shadow over water, gone before it could properly be called a smile, and he said, quietly, perhaps I was not, though I begin to think I am developing an appetite rather late in life. It was not admiration, precisely, what moved through her at that, not yet. Not admiration, but something adjacent to it that she declined to examine too closely, because a woman in her position could not afford to mistake a duke's dry wit for anything warmer than what it plainly was, an idle man's idle amusement, with a clever companion. However her pulse chose to behave in the moment of hearing it. The room as a whole, meanwhile, had begun to notice, in the particular way rooms notice things before anyone in them says so aloud, that Alistair Calder's stillness altered fractionally whenever Eleanor Ashworth entered it, a settling rather than an alertness, the way a hound settles when a particular footstep sounds on the stair. Lady Petham's court took note of it at the next assembly, and took note also, with rather less charity, of the fact that Eleanor had begun to be seated, at dinners now, rather nearer the center of the table than the family had previously permitted, a small shift in geography that meant a great deal in a world where geography was the primary language of status. It was at one of these dinners, hosted by the Dowager Duchess herself at Rothbury House on an evening thick with early summer heat, that Eleanor was first formally presented to Augusta Calder, and she understood within the first 60 seconds of the introduction exactly where her grandson had acquired his stillness, and understood also, with rather more surprise, that the old woman's eyes, pale and startlingly sharp above a face otherwise soft with age, missed nothing whatsoever. So, said the Duchess, settling into her chair with the unhurried authority of a woman who had outlived the need to hurry for anyone, you are the young woman my grandson has been inventing excuses to visit. Sit here, beside me, where I may look at you properly, and tell me something true, since I am far too old to be entertained by anything else. Eleanor sat and told her, when pressed, a version of the truth carefully trimmed of its rawer edges, and the Duchess listened with the particular attentiveness of a woman accustomed to being lied to and grateful, for once not to be. And when Eleanor finished, the old woman said, with the crisp finality of someone closing an account book, "Well, you have more sense in your smallest finger than that Merrick creature has in the whole of his overdressed body, and I have always found that competence, properly hidden, takes considerably longer to discover than birth, but wears very much better once it is found." It was, Eleanor understood, the closest thing to an embrace the old woman was likely to offer a near stranger, and she found herself, unexpectedly, blinking rather harder than the moment strictly required. My mother used to say something rather similar, Eleanor admitted, though in plainer words. that a quiet stitch holds longer than a shouted seam. The Duchess considered this with evident approval. "Your mother," she said, "sounds as though she understood a great deal about the world for a woman who I gather never once set foot in a London drawing room. She understood enough of it to teach me how to survive one without a fortune to protect me," Eleanor said, and the Duchess's sharp eyes softened, briefly, into something almost tender, before hardening again into their habitual assessment. "Then you are considerably better equipped for this world than most of the fools currently occupying it," she said, "and I shall expect you to prove it." It was meant, Eleanor understood, as a compliment of the highest order the old woman was capable of paying, and she carried the warmth of it home that night the way she carried the thimble, hidden, close, and entirely her own. By the following month, the family's fortunes, socially at least, had improved to a degree that would have seemed impossible to Eleanor a season earlier, invitations arriving now that named her specifically, rather than merely including her under the general courtesy extended to Sir Gerald's household, and it was this very improvement, she would later understand, that planted the first seed of what followed. Because a woman who rises unexpectedly in a world built on carefully guarded arithmetic inevitably becomes, to someone, a sum that no longer adds up correctly. It began as the smallest thing, a letter that arrived at Rothbury House, addressed to the Dowager Duchess in a hand disguised just enough to defeat easy recognition. Unsigned, its language careful, and its accusation devastating in its precision. Eleanor learned of its contents only because the Duchess, true to the plain-speaking nature Eleanor had already come to admire, summoned her directly rather than permitting the matter to be whispered around her first. "Someone," said the Duchess, without preamble, laying the letter flat on the table between them with the distaste of a woman handling something that had touched a sick room, "wishes the world to believe that your marriage to Captain Ashworth was never properly recorded at all. That the register at Hartwell Parish, where you claim the ceremony took place, contains no entry for the date in question, and that you have, for 2 years, been living under a name and a widow's claim to which you have no legal right whatsoever." It goes further. It suggests you invented the marriage entirely to secure yourself a place in a respectable household after your father's ruin, and that you have deceived this family, and by extension deceived my grandson, for your own advantage. Eleanor felt the room narrow, briefly, to the single point of the letter, lying flat and pale on the polished wood, and she was aware, in the particular detached way one is aware of a wound before the pain of it arrives, that this was no longer a matter of gossip and small daily arithmetic, but something with teeth, something that could take from her not merely her comfort, but her name, her place, the modest annuity that was the entire and only inheritance her marriage had left her, and, she understood with a colder clarity still, something that would not merely humiliate her, but would humiliate the Duke by association, would make of his attention to her a scandal rather than a courtesy, would hand Camilla and Julian and every drawing room in London precisely the arithmetic they had always wished to perform. It was not accusation that closed her throat in that moment. It was fear, plain and total, though she did not permit her hands, folded in her lap, to betray it by so much as a tremor. "I was married at Hartwell in the spring of 1814, she said, her voice steadier than she had believed it capable of being, by Mr. Josiah Pell, who had held the living there above 11 years, in the presence of my husband's own commanding officer and the sexton's wife, and I have never in my life claimed a single thing that was not true, whatever this letter wishes the world to believe." "I do not for one moment imagine that you have," said the Duchess, with a briskness that Eleanor would remember, gratefully, for the rest of her life. "I did not survive 60 years in society by believing every clever letter that crosses my table, and I have looked at a great many faces telling a great many lies in that time, and yours, my dear, is not one of them. But belief, however sincerely offered, will not silence Lady Petham's circle, who I have no doubt already have a copy of this in their possession by other means, and it will certainly not satisfy Sir Gerald, who I am reliably informed turns the color of curdled milk at the mere word scandal. We must prove it false, and we must prove it quickly, on evidence a fool cannot argue with. Since reputation, once dented, mends a great deal more slowly than cloth. It was the Duke himself who arrived that same afternoon, summoned by his grandmother's note and moving through the house with none of his usual unhurried calm, the first time Eleanor had seen him arrive anywhere as though the destination itself required urgency. "Show me the letter," he said, and read it through twice in a silence so complete that Eleanor could hear her own pulse in her ears, and when he finished, he set it down with a precision that somehow conveyed more violence than slamming it would have. And said only, "This is Merrick's work. I would stake the whole of Rothbury on it." "How can you be certain?" Eleanor asked, though a part of her had already arrived, unwillingly at the same suspicion. "Because a stranger accusing a woman of fraud writes with the cold precision of the law," he said, "and this letter writes with the wounded precision of a man who once wanted something and did not get it. Look here at the turn of phrase, invented so as to spare himself. A convenient fiction, he calls it, the very words he used to use at my grandmother's ball not 2 months past. A man who insults a woman in public rarely troubles to invent a second set of insults when the first set served him so well the first time." It was, Eleanor thought, watching him, a small and telling thing to have noticed and remembered the particular echo of a phrase across 2 entirely different occasions, and she found herself grateful, in a way that startled her with its intensity, that someone in the world had been listening closely enough to catch it. "It is a resemblance," the Duchess said, practically, "but a resemblance is not proof, and we require proof, not merely conviction, since conviction alone will not satisfy a room full of people already primed to believe the worst of a poor relation risen too quickly above her station." Eleanor rose then, without quite deciding to, and crossed to the small writing desk in the Duchess's morning room, where, at the old woman's gesture, she was permitted to sit, and drew from the reticule she had carried that day, out of some instinct she could not later fully explain beyond a lifetime's habit of keeping every piece of correspondence that might one day prove useful, a small bundle of letters tied with plain string, letters she had kept not from sentiment, but from the same careful habit of record that had once saved the household's accounts from Sir Gerald's carelessness. Among them, near the bottom, yellowed now at the folds, were 3 letters Julian Merrick had written her 8 years before, during the brief courtship that had ended the moment her father's debts became known, letters she had kept only because a woman raised by a mother, who taught her that nothing should ever be thrown away that might later be needed, had never quite been able to bring herself to burn them, however little affection remained attached to the paper itself. She laid one beside the anonymous letter now, and the 3 of them, Eleanor, the Duke, and the Duchess, bent over the desk together in a silence that had, for the first time that afternoon, the particular quality of held breath rather than dread. "There," Eleanor said, her finger resting lightly beside a single looping capital that curled back upon itself in a small distinctive flourish before continuing, a habit of hand so particular she had noticed it years ago and half forgotten it until this very moment. "There it is. The same loop, in the same letter, in both hands. He always did make his capitals like a signature rather than a letter," she said. "I used to tease him for it, in another life, before I knew better than to tease a man who could not bear to be laughed at." The Duke straightened slowly, and something moved through his face that Eleanor had not yet seen there. Not the dry composure she had come to expect, nor the careful stillness he wore in company, but something closer to the plain, unguarded satisfaction of a man watching a trap close on precisely the creature that deserved it. "It is enough to begin with," he said, "but it will not be enough to finish. A capital letter proves a hand, not a lie, and I intend that when this is done, no one in London shall be able to say a single word against you that is not proven false on its own separate merits, down to the register itself. I will ride to Hartwell myself." His grandmother regarded him for a long moment with an expression Eleanor could not entirely read, something between approval and amusement, and a very old woman's private satisfaction at watching a thing she had long suspected finally declare itself in the open, and said only, "Take my second carriage. It travels faster over bad road than yours does, and do try, Alistair, not to arrive looking as though you have ridden through the night on a matter of the heart, since half the purpose of this exercise is discretion." He left within the hour, and Eleanor spent the 2 days of his absence in a state she did not care to examine too closely, moving through the ordinary business of the household, the mending, the correspondence, the careful management of Sir Gerald's accounts, with the particular numbness of a woman waiting for a verdict she cannot influence further, while Camilla, sensing blood in water with the same instinct she had always possessed for it, grew solicitous in the exact register that had come to mean the opposite of concern. "Is everything quite all right, Eleanor?" she asked over breakfast on the second morning, her voice pitched for sympathy and her eyes bright with something considerably less generous. "There have been stories, you understand, one cannot help but hear them, and I would hate for you to be caught unprepared should anyone ask you directly." "I should hate that too," Eleanor said, meeting her gaze with a mildness that had, by now, become entirely deliberate rather than merely instinctive, though I find I am not unprepared at all, since the truth, unlike gossip, does not require rehearsal. Camilla's smile thinned very slightly at the corners, the first genuine crack Eleanor had seen in it in 2 years, and she said nothing further, though the pressure of her silence afterward carried its own unmistakable weight, and Eleanor understood, watching her sister-in-law retreat behind her teacup, that Camilla had known something of this letter before it arrived, had perhaps supplied some small detail to the hand that wrote it, a date, a name, a private fact no stranger ought properly to have possessed. Though proving that particular betrayal would have to wait for a quieter reckoning than the one now unfolding. The Duke returned on the evening of the second day, his coat still marked with the dust of hard travel, and he came directly to Rowan Hall rather than to his own house first, a breach of ordinary propriety so plain that even the housekeeper who admitted him raised her eyebrows before recovering her composure. He carried with him a certified copy of the parish register, obtained under the eye of Mr. Josiah Pell himself, alive and in excellent health, and considerably outraged to learn that his own signed entry had been called into question. The ceremony recorded plainly on the 14th of April in the year 1814, witnessed by Captain Ashworth's commanding officer and by the sexton's wife, whose names matched precisely the ones Eleanor had given from memory 2 days before, without a single word of hesitation. "There is more," the Duke said, laying the document before her with the same careful precision he had shown with the forged letter, and Eleanor heard, beneath his composed voice, something that had not quite finished settling from the ride. The curate remembered the day distinctly, not merely from his register, but from memory, because it rained so hard the wedding party was obliged to take shelter under the Lychgate for the better part of an hour before the ceremony could properly begin, and because the bridegroom, waiting, told him that he counted himself the most fortunate man in England despite the weather, having found a woman who would mend a torn coat as readily as she would a broken heart, and considered either equally worth the trouble. Eleanor did not trust her voice for a long moment after that, and when she spoke it was barely above a whisper, because Thomas had said something very like that to her once, on the walk home from that very church. And she had never repeated it to another living soul. "He was not wrong about you," the Duke said quietly, watching her with an expression he had, until that moment, kept carefully guarded, "and I begin to think, Mrs. Ashworth, that I have spent rather too long admiring a woman from a safe and dignified distance, when the evidence of the last 2 days suggests distance was never required in the first place." It was not admiration she felt then, watching him, not merely admiration, but something warmer and more dangerous that she declined, even now, to name aloud, and she said only, "You have not yet found who sent the letter, only whose hand shaped it, and I find I would rather see the matter concluded before I permit myself to feel anything at all about the manner of its unraveling. That," he said, "is precisely the sort of composure I have come to expect of you, and precisely the sort I intend, before this business is finished, to see thoroughly and deservedly undone." The proof, once assembled, moved through society with the particular swiftness reserved for scandal in reverse, the Duchess herself seeing to it that the certified register and the curate's sworn account reached exactly the ears that had first received the anonymous accusation, and within the week it was Julian Merrick, not Eleanor Ashworth, whose name was spoken behind fans with the particular relish reserved for a fall from grace. His authorship of the letter confirmed beyond polite doubt once a second sample of his hand, obtained without his knowledge through an old acquaintance, was laid publicly beside the first by a solicitor the Duke had quietly retained for precisely that purpose. It ought to have felt, Eleanor thought, like triumph, and in some measure it did, a cold, clean satisfaction settling, where fear had lived for the better part of a week, but it carried with it also a strange and unexpected fatigue, the particular exhaustion of a woman who has spent 2 years learning to expect nothing and has now been handed, all at once, considerably more than she knew how to hold. It was the Duke who came to her that evening, near 2 in the morning, when the household had long since retired, and a summer storm that had been threatening all day finally broke over London in earnest, thunder rolling low along the rooftops and rain lashing hard against the windows of the small back parlor where she still sat, unable to sleep, the thimble turning over and over in her fingers in the candlelight. She heard his step in the hall before the housekeeper could announce him, unmistakable even now, unhurried despite the hour, and when he appeared in the doorway, rain still darkening the shoulders of his coat, his eyes found hers across the small candlelit room with an intensity that had, for the first time since she had known him, entirely abandoned its customary reserve, and neither of them spoke for a long moment, the storm outside filling the silence between them with something that felt, unmistakably, like the held breath before a door long closed at last begins, slowly, to open. He did not speak at once, and for a long moment the only sound in the small parlor was the rain driving hard against the glass and the low continuous roll of thunder somewhere out over the river, and then he crossed the threshold and closed the door behind him with a quiet, deliberate click, the first door either of them had ever closed between themselves and the rest of the world. He did not come to her all at once. He crossed the room the way he did everything, in measured increments, as though covering the distance too quickly might frighten off whatever truth he had ridden through a storm to deliver, and Eleanor sat very still and watched him come, her hands folded in her lap around the small brass thimble, as though it were the only ballast keeping her upright in a room that had begun, very slightly, to tilt. "I did not ride to Hartwell for my grandmother's sake," he said, stopping some 3 steps from her chair, the candlelight catching the rain still clinging to his hair. "I told myself I did. I told myself a great many convenient things this past fortnight, that I was defending a member of a household under my family's protection, that I was correcting an injustice any decent man would correct, that a duke owes it to his own name to see a forged accusation answered properly. He took another step, and another, each one costing him, she could see, something considerably more than the physical distance it closed. I did not offer you my arm at my grandmother's ball because a lady had been insulted in my house and manners required an answer. I did not call twice a week with excuses so poor even Sir Gerald began to doubt them because I had developed a sudden passion for cowper or pressed flowers. I did not sit in that morning room watching you correct a column of figures no one else in that house had troubled to check and feel something turn over in my chest that has not turned over in a very long while, perhaps not since I was young enough to believe feeling such a thing was safe. He was close enough now that she could see the rain still beating at his collar and the particular stillness that had left his eyes entirely, replaced by something rawer and far less guarded than she had ever been permitted to see in him before. I have spent 11 years being a duke before I was permitted to be a man, he said, and his voice, when it came now, had shed the dry, ironic register she had grown so accustomed to, had become simply the voice of a person, tired and honest and afraid in a way rank had never previously allowed him to sound. I do not know how to ask for a thing without an estate attached to the asking. I have never had to. But I am asking you now, plainly, without an excuse in my pocket and without a book to return, because I find I would rather stand here and be refused honestly than spend one more evening pretending an interest in cowper. It was, Eleanor understood, watching him, the closest a man of his rank and his particular armor was ever likely to come to laying himself entirely open, and something in her chest ached with the recognition of it, the specific tenderness reserved for watching someone strong set down a weapon they had carried so long they had forgotten it was heavy. She did not answer at once. She had spent 2 years learning that composure was the only currency she owned outright, and she was not yet prepared. Even now, even with her pulse behaving in a manner she could no longer pretend not to notice, to spend the whole of it in a single, unguarded breath. "You have not yet asked me anything, Your Grace," she said, and her voice was steadier than she had any right to expect it to be. "You have only confessed a great many things you evidently find inconvenient to feel." Something that was almost a laugh moved through him, brief and startled, the sound of a man caught out by the very composure he had come here, half hoping to overwhelm. "Then let me ask properly," he said. And he came the last step, close enough now that she had to tilt her face to hold his gaze, and he did not reach for her hand, not yet, though she could see the want of it plainly in the set of his own. "I have asked myself why, these past weeks, more times than I care to admit," he said. "It is not because your name required defending, though it did, and I would defend it again tonight in the same storm if the need arose. It is not because my grandmother wishes it, though she does, loudly, and has told me so at every opportunity since the ball. It is not because society would approve, since half of it will not, and the other half will only pretend to for my sake, which amounts to very much the same insult, dressed in better manners." He paused, and the rain filled the pause the way it had filled every held silence between them since he had entered the room. "I want you," he said, "because when I stood in that morning room watching you correct a mistake no one else would ever have noticed or thanked you for, there was no one there to impress and nothing at all to be gained by noticing you, and I noticed you anyway, and have not been able to stop since. I have been looked at my whole life, Eleanor, by rooms that wanted something from the looking. I find I would like, for whatever remains of my life, to be looked at only by someone who wants nothing from me at all, beyond the plain fact of my company, and I have never in my life met anyone I believed capable of that but you." It was not a question, precisely, and yet it hung in the air between them exactly as one, and Eleanor felt the old brass thimble bite into her palm one final time before her hand, of its own accord, finally opened. "I have spent 2 years being called unclaimed," she said, quietly, testing the word aloud the way one tests a plank before trusting one's full weight to it, as though I were a parcel misdirected, or a debt no one troubled to collect. "I find, Your Grace, that I have grown rather attached to choosing for myself what I am and am not, and I would not consent to trade one kind of claiming for another merely because the second comes wrapped in a title." "Then I withdraw the word entirely," he said, without hesitation, and something in his face eased, as though her resistance had told him more of what he needed to know than easy surrender ever could have. "I do not wish to claim you, Eleanor. I wish, if you will permit the considerably harder thing, to be chosen by you, on whatever terms you find you can live with honestly, and I find I would rather wait a lifetime for that than have the easier thing handed to me tonight out of gratitude or storm or the particular foolishness a late hour makes of a man's judgment." It was, she thought, watching him, the truest thing he had said all evening, truer even than the confession that preceded it, because it asked nothing of her that she had not already, in the privacy of her own unspoken ledger, decided to give. "Yes," she said, and the word arrived quieter than she intended, and steadier than she had any right to expect. "Not because you rescued my name, though you did, and not because the whole of London will approve, though I begin to think they will, and not because a woman in my position would be a fool to refuse a duke, though I have been called a great many worse things than a fool this past fortnight, and could bear that one as well. Yes, because I wish it. Because when no one was watching, in a small back parlor with gray light falling on figures no one else cared to check, I found I wanted your company for its own plain sake, and have not been able to stop wanting it since. Whatever sense told me to do instead." He took her hand then, at last, the same hand that had rested on his sleeve across a crowded ballroom 2 months before. And this time he did not let it go, not when the storm cracked loud enough to rattle the windows, not when she felt the sudden hot press of tears rising, unbidden and entirely unwelcome, at the back of her throat. She did not weep from grief, and she was careful, even in that unguarded moment, to let no one, not even herself, mistake it for collapse. It was simply, she understood, 2 years of carefully rationed truth finally permitted to reach the surface all at once, the particular release of a woman who has held herself so still for so long that stillness itself has become a kind of ache, and when the first tear fell, she did not turn her face away from him to hide it, because she had spent quite enough of her life turning away from things. And she found, to her own faint surprise, that she did not wish to turn away from this. He did not release her hand to offer a handkerchief. Though one sat folded in his pocket, he simply stood there, holding on, letting the storm outside do the weeping the sky itself seemed to require, until the worst of it passed and she drew a long, unsteady breath and said, with the ghost of her old dry composure returning at last to her voice, "I believe, Your Grace, that this is the least dignified I have appeared before you since the night you first offered me your arm." "I have found," he said, drawing her hand up to press his lips briefly against her knuckles, "that dignity was never the quality in you I admired most, though you wear it exceptionally well. It was truth I came for, tonight of all nights, and I find I have gotten considerably more of it than I bargained for, and consider myself the richer for the exchange." By the following spring, when the last of the frost had given way to the particular pale gold light that settles over London gardens in April, the wedding of the Duke of Rothbury to the widowed Mrs. Eleanor Ashworth had long since ceased to be scandal and become, instead, precisely the sort of story London loved best to tell about itself, a tale of quiet virtue rewarded that flattered the tellers nearly as much as it flattered its subject, and Eleanor had learned, with some private amusement, that a story once considered vulgar gossip could be entirely rehabilitated the moment its ending proved advantageous to repeat at dinner parties. Julian Merrick had not been seen at a single gathering of consequence since the spring before, his own forged hand laid bare beside his old courting letters for anyone who cared to compare them, and what remained of his fortune had proven considerably less durable than his charm, once the doors of the better houses quietly and permanently closed against him. He had retreated, it was said, to a small property in the north, where his wit, no longer licensed by an audience willing to laugh, had apparently grown considerably less clever. Camilla Ashworth had not vanished from society so completely, her husband's baronetcy affording her a floor beneath which she could not entirely fall, but her influence had thinned to something brittle and careful. The particular diminishment of a woman who has been quietly and universally understood to have known more than she admitted, and who now smiled a good deal less often at gatherings where the true story of the altar cloth had, in the way such truths eventually surface, become known well enough that no one troubled any longer to credit her with a needle she had never once threaded in earnest. It was on a bright, unclouded morning that the Duchess of Rothbury, formerly Mrs. Ashworth, formerly, before that, plain Eleanor Finch of a small, cold house where a mother's aphorisms had been the only inheritance worth keeping, stood at the edge of a newly finished building in the East End of London, its brick still faintly pink with newness, and watched a crowd of women and girls, widows and daughters of soldiers who had never come home from the wars, gather at its doors for the first time. It had been her own design, conceived in the quiet evenings of that first winter of her marriage, when she could not sleep for thinking of all the women exactly like herself, who possessed a steady hand and a hungry mind, and no single door in the whole of England willing to open for either. A school where such women might learn fine needlework and household accounting and the plain, useful arithmetic that had once been the only inheritance Eleanor herself had ever been given, and be paid honestly for the skill of it rather than watch it stolen by whoever happened to stand nearest the credit when praise was passed around a room. The Dowager Duchess, seated in a chair brought out especially for the occasion, declared it the finest use to which she had ever seen a fortune put, and meant it, and it was she who had insisted, over Eleanor's own quiet protest, that the small display case just inside the entrance hall hold, beneath glass, the altar cloth of vines and doves finally and properly labeled with its true maker's name. And beside it, smaller, easy to overlook unless one knew to look for it, a single tarnished brass thimble, worn thin on one side, with a card beneath it in the Duchess's own firm hand, explaining only that it had belonged, once, to a woman who had taught her daughter that a quiet stitch holds longer than a shouted seam, and that the lesson had, in the end, proven truer than anyone in this world had troubled to notice at the time. Alistair stood beside her now at the top of the steps, the crowd below them thickening with the particular hush that gathers before an important thing is said, and when he raised his hand the murmur of the assembled crowd, tradesmen's wives and society patronesses standing shoulder to shoulder in a manner London had rarely permitted before that year, thinned to silence entirely. There was a time, he said, his voice carrying easily over the hushed gathering in the plain, unhurried register she had come to know so well, when this woman standing beside me was considered, by people who ought to have known better, an encumbrance upon a household that could not be bothered to see her properly. There was a time she was called unclaimed, as though a person without a fortune or a loud enough voice to demand credit for her own work were somehow a thing left over, rather than a thing simply waiting, with more patience than any of us deserved to be seen. They were wrong. He let the words settle, the particular flat finality of a man who had earned the right to say them without fear of contradiction, and continued, his voice gaining, very slightly, the warmth he had once permitted only in private rooms with the door closed. They were wrong to overlook her competence, which built the very numbers that kept a household from ruin while receiving no thanks for the labor. They were wrong to overlook her authorship, which decorated a room with beauty for 2 years running, while another woman wore the credit like a borrowed coat. They were wrong, above all, to overlook her patience, which endured every small daily cruelty this city could invent, without once surrendering the dignity that has since, I am told, become rather fashionable to admire. A ripple of laughter, warm and genuine this time, entirely without the qualified reluctance that had once greeted lesser wit at Camilla's expense, moved through the crowd, and Eleanor felt her husband's hand find hers and hold it in front of every person gathered there, exactly as it had held it that stormy night with no audience at all to witness the gesture. "I built this house," he said, "because my wife believed, long before I had the sense to notice her believing it, that a woman's worth ought not depend on whether the room happens to be watching when she proves it, and I have come to think she is very likely right about most things, having been so thoroughly right about that. It is my hope that the women who walk through these doors after us, and their daughters, and the daughters after them, will never once have to learn the particular patience it took my wife 2 years to teach herself, because the world around them will simply have learned, at last, to look properly the first time." The applause that followed was not the thin, politic clapping of a crowd performing agreement it did not feel. It rose instead the way real weather rises, unbidden, thorough, women in plain wool cloaks and women in silk standing together clapping for the same modest brick building and the same quiet woman at its door, and Eleanor, watching the crowd she had once stood at the edge of, unseen, unclaimed, felt the old brass thimble warm in her closed hand exactly as it had warmed 2 years of evenings bent over other people's cloth, and understood, with a clarity that arrived at last without any grief attached to it at all, that she had always been worth believing in, whether or not the world had troubled to notice in time. It had rained through the whole of the previous night, one final hard storm rolling in off the river, as if the sky itself required one last full accounting before it would consent to clear. And it was only now, standing at the top of the steps with her husband's hand warm around hers and the crowd's applause still settling into the bright-washed air, that Eleanor noticed the sun had fully broken through at last, the wet brick and the wet cobbles catching the light in 100 small, unclaimed sparks, the world rinsed clean and plain and entirely without ornament, exactly the way she had always privately believed the truest things looked once the noise finally cleared away from them. It was not perfect, what they had built together, and it had not been easy. The 2 years of veiled cruelty and quiet accumulation, and one long, frightening week when her whole name had hung on the shape of a stranger's capital letter. But it was, she thought, watching the last of the storm clouds thin toward the eastern rooftops, while her husband's fingers tightened, once, around her own, simply shared, freely, by 2 people who had each learned, in their separate and particular ways, what it cost to go unclaimed. And that, she found, standing in the clean gold light of a morning the storm had finally surrendered, was very much more than enough.